This is Why Don't We Say Hallel on Purim, a conversation where we have the pleasure of learning today with a panel of three teachers, Dr. Shana Strauch Schick, Dr. Jon Kelsen, and Rabbi Joe Wolfson. In this class is a pre-Purim offering at Drisha, and I'm going to hand things over to Rabbi Kelsen to kick things off.
Thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to be with you all. We're approaching Purim, and we have an opportunity here we have a short time together, about 55 minutes. So I'm going to jump right in. But as we approach Purim, and I wish you all in advance a very happy Purim wherever you may be. As we approach Purim, we thought it would be very appropriate to think a little bit together about what this holiday is all about. And the way we're going to do that, I'm joined tonight by my dear colleagues, Dr. Shana Strauch Schick, who's here with us, and Rabbi Joe Wolfson, who will be jumping on in just a few moments. We're Shana and I are in Jerusalem. Joe's in Tel Aviv doing his good work, and we'll jump on soon. And we thought that we would just discuss on the one hand, it's a sort of technical piece of Talmud about a question: why is it that we don't recite Hallel on Purim? It's actually, once you ask the question, you realize how odd it is that we don't recite Hallel on Purim. The major holidays, like Passover, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, we do recite Purim. Even on Rosh Chodesh, beginning of new months, we recite, at least according to custom, part of Hallel, but there's no Hallel to be found on Purim. It's very surprising. So it's a technical question, but we're going to argue that it is actually a central question, or at least I will argue it's a central question, and cuts to the core of what the holiday is about. So I'm going to do is read the Gemara. I'm going to share my screen and read a piece of Talmud with you, a very short piece from Talmud Megillah, the Babylonian Talmud 14a. And then turn to Shana to share some thoughts in it. I'll share some thoughts, Joe will share some thoughts, and I very much hope, or we very much hope, that you all might share your thoughts as well. So we're going to leave time for that, but please be thinking along and thinking with us as we prepare for this holiday together. Okay, so we are kind of close to smack in the middle of Babylonian Talmud Megillah. And I'm just going to start reading and try to explain as simply as possible to get us on the same page, and then turn it over to Shana. So the Gemara asks, the Gemara notes, again, we're jumping in the middle of a sugya, middle of a conversation. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught that there were 48 prophets and 7 prophetesses, Arba'im U'Shmonim Nevi'im U'Sheva Nevi'ot Nitnamnu Lehem Yisrael, who prophesied on behalf of Israel. There were 48 prophets, 7 prophetesses who were offering all these prophecies to Israel over time. V'lo pichatu, v'lo hotiru al masha katuv b'Torah. And nonetheless, in all of their prophetic, engagements and enterprises, they never added to anything, not to one iota did they add to the Torah, chutz mikra Megillah, except for reciting the Megillah, except for the mitzvah, the commandment of reciting the Megillah. We'll bracket here the question of what about all the other rabbinic enactments, but at least in the sense of a self-standing, kind of new institution, the beginning of the Megillah. Perhaps this is a stand-in for the notion of Purim itself, of the entire holiday being innovated. This is the only one that the sages identify here. It's a striking thing. And the rabbis ask, my Jewish, where did they get that from? And the way they ask is, from where do they derive that? Here, Koran translates, what exposition? Right? On what basis did they get that they could do this? So in this tradition, the name of Yeshua ben Karcha, it is what's called a kal v'chomer, right? An argument, what is it, A4TR, an argument from the major to the minor. Umay me'avdut, from the minor to the major, excuse me. Umay me'avdut l'cherut, amrinan shira, mimita l'chayim lo kol shekain. If in the case when recalling the Exodus from Egypt, which is a case of freedom from slavery to freedom, we recite song, we sing, okay, and here they hedge in the translation here that could be for both a song of the sea in Exodus as well as recitation of the Hallel, which we perform on Pesach. Okay, so both Shirat Hayam and call Kriyat Hallel, right? If we do that on Passover, then all the more so should we do that on Pesach, on Purim. Mimita l'chaim lo kol shekain is not the case, and all the more so when we were saved not from merely enslavement. I mean, I use the word merely advisedly, but all the more so, but from when we're at least alive, from death to life, as it were, when we're threatened with annihilation at the hands of Haman and his people, then and we're saved and from death to life, all the more so. Okay, and the Gemara says as follows, and this is really the meat of what we're focusing on here. Ihachi halal nami. So the Gemara says, if that's so, right? If we have a kal v'chomer, if we have this argument from Passover that Purim is all the more so vis-a-vis Passover, and on Passover we recite the Hallel, and I would note again, as I said before, that it's true of other holidays as well, but Passover is sort of the holiday par excellence for our purposes. Then we should say Hallel on Purim. Why do we not recite Hallel on Purim? It's a really great question once you notice it. And the Gemara is going to offer 2 or 3 answers, and let me just review them and then hand it over to Shana and see how this is all landing with Shana this year and Joe and myself and hopefully you all. So Gemara says, first of all, Lefi she'ein omrim Hallel al nesh shebechutz la'aretz, because we don't recite Hallel on a miracle which occurred outside the land of Israel, outside Eretz Yisrael, a nes shebechutz la'aretz. Now, you might be thinking to yourself the following question, which is, wait a minute, I thought that the exodus from Egypt took place, in Egypt and then in the desert. That's outside the land, right? So they say, Yitziat Mitzrayim, the nation of Chutz La'aretz, Hechamrin and Shira. Well, if that's the case, how do we recite the song on, Passover, right? Which also occurred b'Chutz La'aretz, didn't it? Right? Both, Gemara here might be referring to, again, the Song of the Sea or Hallel, the recitation of Hallel liturgically, maybe both. I mean, Passover itself, right, did not take place outside of Egypt, outside of the land, right? So the Gemara responds, the Talmud responds and says, well, that's different. Gemara says, because Passover took place, right, and commemorates that which took place before we entered the land to begin with as a people. Kidditanya, as the rabbis taught in the Breita, prior to the time when the people entered Eretz Yisrael, ad shelo nichnasu Yisrael la'aretz, huchshu kol ha'aretzot lamar shira. Before the people entered the land at the time of Joshua and thereafter, then you could say shiras, you could sing, right, these songs of praise in any for any land, in any land, or for a miracle that happened in any land, like Egypt. Once they entered the land, mishenichnasu Yisrael la'aretz, then lo huchshu kol ha'aretzot lamar shira. Once entered the land, then that was no longer the case. Not all the lands were appropriate for saying Shira, only the land of Israel. Okay, that's number 1. Okay, so the first answer, though, that Gemara gives as to why we don't say Hallel on Purim, is because it is a nes shebechutz la'aretz. It's a miracle that occurred, commemorates that which occurred outside the land, and we don't say Shira on such occurrences. Rav Nachman, the sage of Nachman, the Amorav of Nachman, offers a different answer. And he says 3 words, kriyata zo halela. Kriyata zo halela. The reading of the Megillah itself is, I'll try to read it literally for now, we can come back and unpack it, is an act of reciting Hallel. The reading is, its praise. Why don't we recite Hallel on Purim? The reading of the Megillah is its Hallel. We'll have to understand what he means by that. We'll talk about this, but let me go to the third line here. Rava Amar, and I'll read this as, it's a bit ambiguous, but let's assume Rava here is offering the third answer. Rava says, well, Bishlam Mahatam, in the case of Passover, remember we're wondering, why don't we say Hallel like we do on Passover? By the Hallel of, Hallel HaMitzri, which commemorates Seit Yisrael Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt. So it starts, if you recall, Hallelujah, Hallelujah, Avdei Adonai, Hallelujah, Shem Adonai. May the servants of God give praise. May they praise the name of God. So he says, Hallelujah, Avdei Hashem, V'lo Avdei Paro. The import there, the sense there, right? The meaning is, you are Avdei Hashem. You are servants of God. We are servants of God, commemorated on Passover, because we are no longer, or at least in part because we're no longer servants of Pharaoh. So not being servants of Pharaoh allows us to now cast ourselves to remember the people as servants of God. Elahacha, but here, right? With regards to Purim, Hacha, Hallelu Avdei Hashem, Velo Avdei Achashverosh. Right? Are they going to hear Velo Avdei Achashverosh, a question mark? Could we really say, with regards to Purim, that we are no longer the servants, the slaves of a human king, like we no longer the servants of Pharaoh? Akate Avdei Achashverosh Anan. We are indeed still, right, servants of Achashverosh. We are still servants of Achashverosh. Some variants here, by the way, say Akate Avdei Achashverosh Ninhu, that they, Rabbi speaking of in the past, they were no longer, we're still the servants of Achashverosh. Others read, we are still the servants of Achashverosh. So we have three answers here, and the Gemara, as to where we're going to say Hallel, the Gemara goes on, but we're going to stop there. But let me just review and hand it over to Shana, and then I'll jump in. And Joe, again, people should be learning with us, thinking with us. Feel free to jump in. Three answers. Why don't we just have Hallel on Purim? Number one, because it's a nes shebachutza la'aretz. It's a miracle of, outside the land, which occurred outside the land. That's number one. Two, Rav Nachman, which is on the screen, Kriyata zo Hallel. The reading of the Megillah is the Hallel. Why don't we have a Hallel? We do. The reading of the Megillah. Rava says, because Akate Avdei Achashverosh Anan, we are still servants of Achashverosh. Okay, so what do we do with this? So I'm going to hand it over to Shana. I'm going to stop screen sharing, but Shana, if you want me to, I can just put it right back on in a minute. But Shana, please, how's this landing with you this year? What are you thinking about?
Thank you so much, John. And it's really such a privilege to be here and to be able to learn with everyone here tonight or today, wherever you are. So right now, at this moment in time, what jumps out to me about this sugya, which honestly I never thought about before the moment we're in, is how this sugya, this passage is putting forth two different perspectives or of values that stand in a tension that I think are at the core of not only the Jewish experience throughout history, but that has become so glaring at this moment in time in particular. And that is, on the one hand, victory, jubilance, invincibility, a gratitude, versus caution, humility, not to take things for granted, maybe Jewish anxiety and paranoia. So this is the tension I see in this Gemara. So now let's go back to and unpack that text that we just read. So again, we see there's a debate in this Gemara that first we're told that there's this unique innovation to read the Megillah. And it's due to the analogy with Yetziat Mitzrayim, with the Exodus. If we had to sing praise to God when we were freed from slavery, all the more so should we sing praise to God when we were saved from mass extermination. So then the question is, okay, we took the analogy part of the way, but why don't we take it the whole way and recite Hallel as we do on a Pesach, on a Passover? So I want to start with the second answer, which was Rabbi Nachman's answer, which is, we do in fact say Hallel. And what's he really saying? That Purim, the miracle of Purim, is just like the miracle of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And so we get to celebrate with all the joy and jubilation of Yetziat Mitzrayim. We're good. Mission accomplished, in the words of a president who seems to get better with age, or by comparison. So according to Rabbi Nachman, we read the Megillah, and that is our saying Hallel. It's our victory anthem. But then there's Rava's answer, which is, well, not so fast. This isn't actually a complete victory. We don't have self-determination. We're still at the mercy of a Gentile ruler. He happened to spare us this time, but our situation remains precarious. We are the subject of a benevolent ruler's whims, and there's no guarantee. Now, in terms of the first anonymous position that we saw, which is we don't say Hallel on miracles that occur outside of Israel, and as John already pointed out, hey, wait a minute, Yetziat Mitzrayim was outside of Israel. Now the question is, how do we read this? Does the first anonymous view actually really agree with Rev Nachman, meaning would they say, really, we should say Hallel because a Purim is on par with the Exodus, with the redemption from slavery, but due to a technicality, we don't. So there's no fundamental dispute between that first view and Rev Nachman. It's just technically because it occurred outside of Israel, we can't say Hallel, okay? Or does that first anonymous view really echo what Rabbi is saying? It's that really, if something occurs outside of Israel, it means just by definition, it's not a complete and total win. We're still precarious. We still don't have self-determination. So that is the question about how to read that first view. But what I think really comes out of it is that we have these two different views of, yes, we're good versus not so fast. We're okay. We dodged this bullet, but we can't take anything for granted. We can't let down our guard. Okay, so those are the two views. Now, of course, the question is, okay, really, but so what? I mean, either way, we read the Megillah. Okay, so whether you want to read the Megillah as expression of Hallel, or you want to read it as, okay, it's a praise, albeit a less, a confident form or a less definitive form of praise than Hallel, but there doesn't seem to be any real difference between these views, practically speaking. So I want to talk about first a technical halachic difference that can emerge from it, and then get back to the kind of worldview philosophical difference that emerge from it. So first, halachically, there actually can be a practical difference that emerges from this debate, nafkamina, if you will. And it relates to the blessings one says before performing any mitzvah. So there's a general rule when we do commandments, we bless on it. So when you light candles before the Sabbath, before Shabbat, you bless. When you take the 4 species on Sukkot, you bless. And what is the purpose of the blessing? That is actually a discussion more from the early modern commentators. Particularly, it comes up in a commentary on Rabbi Yosef Kara's Shulchan Aruch, a commentary known as the Shach, where he points out, does the blessing before mitzvah model the blessings you make before you eat food? Meaning, is it like asking permission to do this mitzvah the way we ask permission to eat food? Or does the blessing model more the blessings of praise and thanks to God? Like when we see like a beautiful, natural phenomena, we make a blessing on it. When something good happens, we make a blessing on it. So what does the bracha, the blessing before a mitzvah model? Now, this is relevant to us because there's actually 2 different mishnayot, one with regard to Hallel and one with regard to reading the Megillah on Purim, as to whether one does make the blessing before both of these rituals. So there's a Mishnah in Hukah 3:11, which says that whether one makes a blessing before saying Hallel is subject to a kasser adam, and there's a similar Mishnah in Megillah with regard to the blessing, whether one makes a blessing before reading the Megillah as well. So how does this relate to us? Well, if we go back to Rav Nachman's view, this actually makes sense. If the blessing before doing the mitzvah is really about praise and thanks to God, then we can understand, according to Rav Nachman, why one wouldn't make a blessing before either saying Hallel or reading the Megillah, because they're also forms of praise and thanks to God. So making a blessing, one can see, would be redundant. Whereas for Rava, there would be more of a reason to make the blessing. And just parenthetically, in the Gemara, the blessing is absolutely made before both Hallel and Megillah. And the blessing in the Mishnah is interpreted as a blessing one says after Hallel and Megillah. So that's just a technical halachic difference between these two different positions of Rava on the one hand and Rav Nachman on the other. But now I would like to come back to the difference in the world of views that are expressed in these two explanations as well. That these are two different approaches between these two answers. Rabbi Nachman, as you can see in the chat, Kriyata zu Hallela, reading the Megillah is Hallel, versus Rabbi who says we are still subjects to Achashverosh. That these are two different world views that also are characteristic of these two specific rabbis as well. Although both Rebbe Nachman and his student Rava, they were teacher and student, are Babylonians. They both live in Sasanian Iran. Iraq and Iran is what ancient Babylonia would have been. And they're both still living under a Persian rule. As Rava observes, throughout the Bavli, it just so happens that the personality of Rebbe Nachman, he's someone who's depicted as, I guess we could say, very comfortable in Persia. He is kind of, seen as this aristocratic Persian. He has very close ties to the exilarch, the Reshu Kaluta. This very famous story in Kiddushin 70a, where another rabbi is just constantly criticizing Rebbe Nachman for his use of Persian words, for his Persian sensibilities, for the way he, even how he lets women be more active in the way like Persians would be, at least in this Gemara. He is someone who's very at home in Persia. And so it's not surprising that he would also take this very secure, confident approach. His view being, we are good. Let's say Hallel. This is great. It's the golden Medina, right? Again, mission accomplished. His student Rava, on the other hand, seems to be much more sensitive to their precarious existence. And actually, one daf earlier on a 13a, Rava actually criticizes Mordechai in the Purim story for not bowing to Haman, and thus instigating Haman's rage against the whole Jewish community and seeking their, mass extermination. So we see there's a realism to Rava and a humility to his approach as well. And this is what Rava is telling us. Yes, it's wonderful we were saved, and we're grateful, and we read the Megillah and we celebrate it. But we're not in the clear. And this is a tension. I think, we can see this and we can feel this throughout our history, whether it's, the golden age of Spain, the beginnings of Ashkenaz, the good existence Jews had in Provence and France and Barcelona and the Arab countries. Think of the 6-Day War versus the Yom Kippur War. We are constantly reminded of our this lesson of we're not in the clear. We can't lose our humility and let down our guard. And I think this is so particularly poignant in the wake of October 7th, in the wake of the recent probes, which are looking into the failures of October 7th. This is, I think, ultimately what this sugya tells us, that this tension exists, it has existed, and it continues to exist. We must celebrate our wins. We must show gratitude and, and thanks to God, but we can't be guided by our hubris and our arrogance. We must thank God, but we can't take anything for granted. And that is what is just jumping out to me from this sugya at this moment. 2 years ago, I would have just done the halachic piece about the Birchat HaMitzvah, but this is what I'm seeing right now. So let us be worthy to an ultimate and complete redemption and victory so that we can sing Hallel with the confidence of Rebbe Nachman. Thank you so much. I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you very much, Shana. That's a very interesting way of thinking about it. And we prepared this a little bit, by the way, but a lot of this is unscripted. So you're getting it live along with the rest of us. Let me start with the point you made about Rava and Rav Nachman, where Rava being in Persia himself, or in Babylonia, in the same region. And when Rava says, "Listen, we can't recite Hallel because it would be inappropriate to say Hallel because we are still servants of Achashverosh," I think there are at least three ways of reading that. Right? One is the we he refers to is really they, as that variant that I mentioned indicates.
Mhm.
Minhu, they are. That in the story itself, the story of Passover ends with Pharaoh gone, and the Jewish people now being servants of God, or available to become servants of God. They move from there basically into Sinai with some interludes. But the Megillah, let's note, begins with the reign of Achashverosh, and it ends with the reign of Achashverosh.
Yeah.
Right? He's this king over the whole
Mhm.
world. And at the end, the last verses, right, have him, acting like a king, right, putting
Right.
tax, imposing taxes.
Taxes and his, accomplishments. Yes. It's
Exactly.
like very even anticlimactic. Like
In a
the
way, yes,
Jewish
exactly.
people, they send this letter out, everyone takes Purim. And so Ahasuerus, he did these taxes and he has these provinces. And if you want to read more about him, see his chronicles. So
Yeah, so maybe it's anticlimactic, or maybe it's part of the point, right? Or the anticlimax is actually part of the point, which is that the redemption is sandwiched within his reign, right? It takes place during his reign, in the beginning and in the end. That's one possibility, that the story opens and ends with us being servants of Achashverosh, and that's what the story is about. Another possibility is what you indicated, which I think was really interesting, which is that Rava saying, "Hey, we," right, like looking around contemporaneously, horizontally, right, at his own time period, we're still living essentially under the reign of not Achashverosh proper, but the heirs in some sense of Achashverosh, and that's our reality. And your point about him versus Rav Nachman is fascinating. And I want to suggest maybe a third possibility, which is that Rava is speaking, and I have to say that I don't think Rabbi Silber is on this call, but he is on this call because his teaching has influenced all of us, and certainly my own way of thinking about these things. That Rava is maybe also saying that when we are wearing sort of perm lenses or have a perm head on, right, then we are living in Achashverosh land. Okay, and it's a way of thinking about reality. Reality, meta-historically, he means, right? It sometimes feels like a reality in which, we've been fully redeemed. Passover, maybe the other other pilgrimage festivals, Passover for sure, we're redeemed from Pharaoh. Pharaoh is, gone in the sea, and here we are only under the dominion of God. And other times the world feels differently redeemed, if you will, right? If redeemed at all. That's the world in which we live. That meta-historical, or sort of ahistorical, right, non-contingent, existential understanding of
mhm.
our reality, which Rava may be sort of tapping into and saying, in that reality, Hallel is simply inappropriate or irrelevant. Hallel, remind you, Halu Avdei Hashem, Halu, right? Halu Hashem Hashem, Hishim Hashem Mavarach Me'atav Yad Olam, right? Imagines a world and describes a world which on Purim we don't really recognize. That's not what we're doing on Purim. Right? Purim, we're actually giving voice to a different experience of reality, and therefore, the Hallel would be inappropriate. I mean, let's just remind ourselves again that it starts with praising the name of God, and that's the one name that's not explicitly in the book, right? It's the one book in which God's name is not there. Yahweh Hashem Hashem Hashem. Even think about the description, right? God's name, Mizrach Shemesh Amavoo, from east to west, right? From the sun rising to setting. God's name is actually in the Megillah, and the only king's name who seems to have currency from Hodu Vad Kush, right, across the known world, is Achashverosh, not God. Okay, so it's actually the description of the world in Hallel, of the God who is recognized everywhere, who acts, intervenes miraculously, revealed miracles, etc. The shaking, sea, the fleeing Jordan. All of these things are totally absent, and therefore Rava may be saying, it's not relevant for our world. And maybe that's also, by the way, what the first answer was getting to when it said, it's a
Mhm.
nation, which is to say, again, we can understand that contingently, right? That means that it happened to take place outside the land of Israel, but the Gemara itself notes that's an odd thing to say, right? Because so the Passover and has to sort of answer it, and it answers it the way it answers it. But maybe we'd say that the point is not when it happened historically. The point is that it is a chutz la'aretz. If you want to say it's a galut story by its nature, not contingently, but inherently. It's about living in exile, yes. It's about living outside the land, but even that I don't mean in terms of the historical weapon,
Right.
up and down of Jewish history. I just
Right.
mean
I don't think it's like exile per se. It's, I mean, right now,
outside the land, right?
Israel, but as long as our lives are contingent, this is relevant.
Yeah, which just seems to be a way of thinking about life. It's contingent. We're outside our land, right? We're not. It's a whole different story, right? It's like you're not in the garden, you're out of the garden. It's a whole different story, right? And in that story, Hallel is not recited. So that might be, I think, what the Gemara is getting at in some of these answers. That's at least how I see it. It's giving voice to a different level of experience. And let me just conclude, and I'll turn it over to Joe, who we're so glad is with us. With the second answer, Rav Nachman, which is in the chat, Rav Nachman says, Kriyata zo halela. What does that even mean, right? Its reading is Hallel. So, you could take that quite literally, correct? So that recitation of the Megillah is itself, the Hallel of Purim, right? And the way the Meiri, one of our, medieval authorities, one of our medieval sages, a Provençali scholar, so he's actually he's basically, like a lone wolf on this one, but he takes that really strongly. And he says, Megillah, the Megillah is our way of doing Hallel on Purim. And that means that, let's say you're in a situation in which you can't recite, right, Hallel on Purim for whatever reason, you don't have a Megillah, whatever reason, you can't, excuse me, nothing, no Megillah. For some reason, whatever, you can't recite the Hallel, whatever reason, right? So he says you can actually, I'm sorry, I'm saying it backwards. You can't recite the Megillah, excuse me, because you don't have a Megillah. So he says then you could recite the Hallel. And the Hallel might, to some extent, be diavad, right? Like, constitute a second tier fulfillment of the reading of the Megillah. This notion, right? This is strong reading of the reading is the Hallel. The Megillah is our Hallel to such an extent that you can't recite the Megillah, then you recite Hallel instead. That's basically alone, like a dat yachid, right? It's a solitary opinion picked up by the later decisors. I don't want to get into that right now, unless you all want to in a few minutes, right? But most reject that, right? But he takes it very strongly as if to say, like, yeah, the Megillah and Hallel, right, are really like very intimately linked in sort of an identity, right? They're related in that level. Others take issue with him very strongly and say, no, you're totally misunderstanding the Gemara. It doesn't mean that they're saying that they're sort of equivalent or fungible at any level. It means that they accomplish analogous tasks. They perform analogous functions. But, lahavdil, right? Like each for their own holidays. Mutatis mutandis is to say, what the Hallel is to Passover, the Megillah is to Purim. To wit, that on Passover we recite a series of Psalms, Psalm 113 and on, right, from Sefer Tehillim, which tells the story of Passover in a way which is, germane to the tone and the character of the holiday. Open miracle, full redemption, right? Unfettered joy, as Shana was kind of getting at, right? Full confidence, right? But Satan, et cetera, et cetera. Hallelujah, Shem Hashem, God's name is everywhere from the east to the west. So that is one picture of reality. Apropos what I was saying before, at least when I'm reading this today, as Shana said this year, and specifically maybe last year, that is not the story of Purim. That's not what we're doing on Purim. Purim is giving voice to the human, or certainly the Jewish experience, but I'd say the human experience of a world which is redeemed, if redeemed at all, in a totally different way. And to recite Hallel in the sense of the text, right, from Psalm 113 and on Purim would be like totally inappropriate. That's how others respond to Meiri. They totally reject Meiri, most, right? It would be totally bogus to the character of the day, right? And kind of counterfeit, right, to recite Hallel and Purim. Purim is a story of the Megillah. And that's a story where God's name does not appear. And I'm not going to go over the whole Megillah, but that's a story where you start with Achashverosh and you end with Achashverosh. And within you have Mordechai and Esther and the Jewish people. and their attempts to save. And maybe there's a God who is the king in the background, orchestrating it. That depends on how you read the story and how you read reality, but it's a totally different thing. Okay, and what's amazing about this actually, what's redemptive about this actually, is that even so, even though that sounds kind of dour, perhaps, it's a chag. It's actually a holiday that the rabbis, or the prophets, I should say, institute, right? And spreads out through all of Israel. There's redemption to be had there. Let me just close. I'll hand over to Joe. I was going to say, I want to raise the question of, I think that rebuke of the Meiri is quite powerful, and that's the majority sort of tone. But one wonders, how is the Meiri how would the Meiri defend his opinion? How would he explain how the Megillah constitutes a kind of Hallel, to the extent that they're fungible? I actually think what I'm going to do is I'm watching the clock. I'm actually going to pause on that question. Maybe we'll circle back to it. But for now, I'm actually going to try to invite Joe over here, and I will remove the spotlight from myself. And Joe, if you're here, you could maybe Kayla, you could spotlight Joe for us. And Joe, what are you seeing this year?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me, John. It's a pleasure to again be back teaching at Drisha. Haven't done so for a little while. Last time was from New York. Now greetings from Tel Aviv, and it's also a great pleasure to be able to learn and discuss with two scholars of the caliber of Shana and Jon. So thank you for having me. It's really interesting that none of us, of the three of us, are particularly interested in the third answer. Sorry, pardon me, in the first answer. That seems to be across the board, and I'm going to follow those who came before me and again focus on the latter two. Perhaps the Gemara itself can be read as sort of rejecting the first answer, that both Rav Nachman and Rava certainly think that theoretically one can say Hallel on a miracle that occurs outside the land of Israel. Let me start with Rav Nachman. Kriyata zo hilula. It's reading. The reading of the Megillah is the praise, is the Hallel. It's worth noting that in addition to the kind of out there opinion of the Meiri that Jon just spoke about, this is the opinion that the Rambam codifies in Mishnah Torah. It's actually in Hilchot Chanukah, which is where he teaches the laws of Hallel, and he says which days we do say Hallel. And during that he says, and we don't. And on Purim we say the Megillah, the Kriyata zo Hilula. What does this mean? I want to draw a distinction, which is a classic, what is sometimes referred to as a brisker distinction, an analytical distinction between two forms of Hallel. Sometimes we speak about Hallel in a quite formalized sense. There is a text and it needs to be recited. On a certain number of days of the year, we say what's called Hallel Shalem, the full Hallel. Sfaradim make the bracha ligmor et Hallel, to say the complete Hallel. On other days, Rosh Chodesh and the like, we do what's called Chatzi Hallel, which is quite sort of, we're speaking about it in sort of quantifiable textual terms. But other times, we call Hallel Shira a song, praise, something which seems to sort of emerge from within us. It's not coincidence, I don't think, that Hallel, more than anything else, is sung, is something which is joyously sung together. Its only competitor almost would be Kabbalat Shabbat. We do musical Hallels. And we see this distinction in the text. So, for instance, we don't say full Hallel at the end of Pesach, right? We only say full Hallel at the beginning of Pesach. Why is this so? Well, two answers are given. The Gemara in Masechet Erechim gives a rather technical answer. It says because The days of Pesach have no distinction between their korbanot. They have the identical number of korbanot, of offerings that were brought in the Mikdash throughout. In other words, there's no seemingly independent halachic identity to the end of Pesach that there isn't there at the start of Pesach. And that's distinct from Sukkot, where you say full Hallel every day of Sukkot, because each day of Sukkot has a different number of korbanot. So that's the first answer. We don't say Hallel at the end of Pesach because it doesn't have anything new to add when it comes to the offerings. But there's a different response, and this is a midrash, which is a well-known midrash in Yalkut Shimoni, which says that what happens at the end of Pesach? The end of Pesach is Kriyat Yam Suf. It's the splitting of the sea, and it's the drowning of the Egyptian army. Bikshu malachei hasharet lashir shira. The angels requested to sing God's praise, and God responds to them, Ma'aseh yadai tovim bayam. My children, the Egyptians, are drowning in the sea. V'atem omrim lafanai shira, and you want to sing my praise in front of me. And so in order to sort of mark the solemnness and the somberness that even the Egyptians are God's children, we don't say Hallel at the end of Pesach. So in the Brisker sort of analysis, these two different reasons work on the different tracks, right? According to the idea that Hallel is like a fixed text, it's about a Kriyah, then we need the technical reason of there is not a separate korbanot. But according to the idea of Shirah, that Hallel is this sort of spontaneous songs of praise, then we need the idea of the midrash, that there is something somber about the end of Pesach which prevents us from being able to sing out. I think, and here I'm bringing it back to Rav Nachman, I think that this phrase, Kriyata zu Hilula, is not a sort of a technical, oh, we happen to say Hallel, we do say Hallel and we say it via the Megillah. Rather, it gives us a powerful and a beautiful insight into, I think, an aspect of Hallel. That Hallel is just this spontaneous description of our lives. It's a spontaneous shirah. And sometimes, and this is what the Megillah captures, sometimes simply telling the story of Am Yisrael in a specific moment at a specific time, and of the individual heroes and heroines within Am Yisrael, that's not simply a historical, journalistic act. That itself is a song of praise to Am Yisrael. And a song of praise to Hashem about the eternity of Am Yisrael. And to echo Shana, and especially teaching this from Israel, I feel that so much of the stories of the last 18 months, I just took this off my shelf. I'm imagining that a number of you are familiar with it. In Hebrew, it's called Yom Echad Ba'Oktober. It was translated into English recently, 40 stories from the day of October 7th. In their own way, these stories are a song of praise themselves, of the heroism of Am Yisrael. Kriyata zu Hilula, I think, is a way of saying that our praise is not simply a formalized text, these Tehillim, but rather something that springs deeply from us. So Rava says, Adayin avdei Achashverosh. We're still slaves to Achashverosh. And I think the way in which most people read Rava's answer is that Hallel is what you would say if it was really something to celebrate, but Purim doesn't get to that stage quite. It doesn't quite have the full Yeshua. It doesn't get of Pesach. It doesn't get it's not joyous enough to say Hallel on. But I want to flip it around. Purim is the ultimate joyous day, right? We all know that, and Rava knew that as well. And I'm pretty sure Rava's Purim was also joyous. So what is he telling us? I think what Rava is doing, he's distinguishing two versions of celebration. He's saying, yeah, there is something called Hallel. And Hallel is said on the exceptional moments of Pesach, of Shavuot, of Chanukah, when there is something just so remarkable and so complete that we say Hallel. But here is the remarkable chidush of Purim. even though we don't say Hallel, because we are still slaves to Achashverosh, because the world is still full of pain and suffering and our redemption is far from complete. Nevertheless, what Purim represents is the ability to still celebrate amidst a world which is imperfect, amidst a reality in which there is still so much pain in it. To say Hallel would be to say everything is great, right? And like we do on Pesach. And that we can't do, says Rava. But we are still celebrating despite everything. The non-saying of Hallel here is something sort of remarkable, not that dampens our joy, but says that the joy is despite the fact that we are still the slaves of Achashverosh. And I want to share, this was doing the rounds last year. I'll finish with this, a passage, a short passage from the Eish Kodesh. The Eish Kodesh is the Piachetzna, a rabbi, Hasidic, Polish rabbi, living through the Shoah and continuing to write his drashot. And this is what he wrote in 1940. It's a well-known comparison between Purim and Yom Kippur, Yom Kippurim, the day that is like Purim. And he draws it in the following way. And he says that we fast on Yom Kippur, not if we want to, if we feel like it. We fast on Yom Kippur, ki chok hu. It's a law, regardless of whether we feel it's going to work for us, whether it's going to be good for our ability to do teshuvah. We fast because the Torah commands us to fast. And the same thing is true on Purim. On Purim, we celebrate even if we don't feel like celebrating. Even if around us there is devastation and pain and suffering, on Purim we still need to celebrate. And then he takes it a step further. He quotes this Talmudic tradition that there is some almost magic to Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur works for Teshuvah, even if we, the individuals, have not done the requisite Tahalich HaTeshuvah, the process of perfecting ourselves. Yom Kippur mechaper, Yom Kippur atones even in itself. And he says the same is true for Purim. Af shelo haya ha'ish ha'Yisraeli b'simcha, k'fi shetzarich liyot. Even if a person in Israel does not have the joy that they should have, because they can't, because they're surrounded by pictures of those who are still held hostage. They are surrounded by the terrors that the Piachetzna was surrounded by. And therefore, their avodah on Purim is not b'shleimut, it's not complete. Mikol makom, ha'yeshua v'asimcha sha'purim po'el al Yisrael. Nevertheless, the redemption and the joy which Purim works for Israel, gam ata po'el v'oseh, still nevertheless works. What I think he is capturing in a far more extreme circumstance than we find ourselves in is the ability to celebrate, the need to celebrate, even though we are still slaves to Achashverosh, even though there are still brothers and sisters and sons and daughters in Gaza. But nevertheless, Purim represents that despite it all, we still celebrate.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much. I think on that powerful note, I think that we will we'll close out our short session here today. I think what we've perhaps learned here, and I think again my colleagues Joe and Shana for teaching me and for being chavruto, and for all of you for joining us, is on the one hand, I hope a deeper understanding of Purim proper, but also perhaps an insight into our own contemporary world experience this year specifically. So, yeah, Beth, please share thoughts or questions, or go ahead.
I thought about bringing this up, and then I thought, no, I'm not going to bring it up. But then
Beth,
you
your
mentioned
thoughts?
it wasn't in the Megillah. In Torah study with some friends yesterday, one of my friends mentioned a little phrase that occurs in chapter 4 of the Megillah, where Mordecai's talking to Esther and he's asking her to intervene. And he tells her that if she doesn't intervene, we will be saved from some other quarter while you and your family will perish. And we were talking about what that other quarter might be. And to several of us, it seemed like that could only be God. But we don't know what is really meant by that. And I wanted to know if anyone in attendance or any of our scholars who presented today have any thoughts about that. It's in the Megillah, chapter 4. It's either verse 13 or 14, I forget which. When Mordecai is talking to Esther and asking her to intervene, one little snippet that he says to her is that if she doesn't help, our deliverance will come from another quarter. But you and your family will perish, he says to Esther. And so what my friends and I were talking about yesterday is, what is that other quarter? Where is that other path to being saved?
Let me open up to the whole Beit Midrash here. Anyone have any ideas?
I could just share my thoughts, and it's very, influenced by the worldview of Chazal and therefore my own, but just God's name never appears in the Megillah famously, but the Megillah is, representing the way the world runs. So if you're a God-fearing person, you believe that the world runs the way it does, but God is behind all of it. And so if God wants the Jewish people to be saved, they're going to be saved, whether it's through Hester, who was put there for a reason, or it'll be some other way. But if that's what's meant to happen, then it's going to happen. So that's certainly how Chazal would read it. And the religious significance that, Megillat Esther has. And Purim. That's my thoughts. I'll look at someone else.
It's funny. It says the Hebrew is mimakom acher, not from you, meant from another
Yeah,
place.
mimakom acher.
Chazal, exactly. Chazal would probably say hamakom.
Right. I mean,
the other place.
Melech, anytime there is just
Right.
That's a good question. It's a good pasuk. It's also a turning point, just in the Megillah.
Right.
From that point on, Esther goes from a passive, also really silent, to active.
Yeah.
I can share a piece that I like very much, which builds off of what Shana said. I came across this last year. There's a collection, a commentary on the whole Tanakh called, very popular in Israel, called Da'at Mikra. And
Is that still a popular?
It used to be
It's great.
popular.
Right, it used to be popular.
I
I own it. We all do.
you see it in a lot of homes.
Still learn it, right?
And a great, a really special person who it's worth reading up about his life story, called Amos Chacham, was the overall editor of it, and he wrote the commentary on the Esther portion of it. And on this he says as follows, Beth. He says what Mordechai is capturing in that line to Esther is something fundamental about Jewish faith. That on the one hand, Mordechai needs to convince Esther to act, and he knows how much depends on it. But on the other hand, and I'm actually able to draw it up here, on the other hand, it almost doesn't matter. That he is convinced that it's going to be okay. And not just Mordechai, but all of us. All of us, we all need to do our best to fight for and look out for Am Yisrael as best we can. But at the same time as that, what is called hishtadlut, we all just need to have the deep emunah that it's going to be all right. We don't know how it's going to be all right. We don't know where the salvation is going to come from, but it's going to come, right? And Mordechai is a message to all of us in that way, right? That even if you don't know where, that doesn't matter. He doesn't lose it for a second. We're going to be okay. I want you on the team, Esther, and I want you to do what you need to do. But if you don't, I'm not worried about Yisrael. We're going to be okay. But you then will perish. Just a beautiful, beautiful piece that Amos Chacham gives us there.
Thank you. I think we have time just for one more quick one. So Eva?
Eva, hi. I wanted to ask Shana to review what she said about the two different modalities of brachot. It went by too fast, and it's something that I'm not familiar with.
I apologize. We had only 10 minutes. But yeah, I mean, so there are different kinds of blessings that we have, just liturgically. We have the blessings we make, before eating food. Those are called a bercha and nehenim, the blessings we get from a pleasure we partake of this world. And one explanation for it provided in the Gemara is like getting a permission. God, please let me enjoy this food that you provided. So that's one model of a blessing. And another model of a blessing is what's called perchat shavach v'hodaya, a blessing just giving thanks and praise to God. So when we see, a rainbow, or a huge group of Jewish people, or a really beautiful person, you say, wow, thank you, God, for, making these wonders. So there's a question, and this is a very technical kind of question, is then there's a birchot ha-mitzvah, blessings you make before performing mitzvot. So is that its own category, or does it conform to either of those two models? Is it like asking permission? Please, God, you're letting me perform your mitzvot. Can I please do this? Or is it, wow, God, thank you for letting me perform your mitzvot? So that's what that point was. Sorry. Thanks for asking.
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. We have to, with that, sign off to make room for the next year. More learning today. Chag Purim Sameach to all, and be well. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. On March 23rd, we will have our, I believe, 16th annual reoccurring pre-Purim lecture. You can sign up at drisha.org/classes for, and it was on that night, how the Gideon story revolutionizes Pesach. And with that, see you all, be well, and Purim Sameach.